The sun hung merciless in the Arizona sky, casting long shadows across the red earth that stretched endlessly in every direction. Sarah's bare feet had long since stopped feeling the sharp stones and thorny brush that littered her path. Each step sent waves of pain through her swollen, bleeding soles, but she pressed on, clutching the small bundle against her chest with trembling arms. Little Mary, barely 6 months old, had stopped crying hours ago, her small body limp with exhaustion and thirst. Sarah's cracked lips moved in silent prayer as she stumbled forward, her once blue dress now torn and stained with dust, sweat, and desperation. In her free hand, she gripped a crumpled piece of paper, the last thing Thomas had given her before everything fell apart. The words written in his careful script had become her only hope. If something happens to me, find Nayeli's son. He lives near the Red Rocks. Show him this. He will help. Sarah had no idea who Nayeli was, or if this mysterious son even existed. But with the ranch burned, Thomas dead, and the baby starving, she had nowhere else to turn. The nearby settlements wanted nothing to do with a woman traveling alone with a child, especially not one whose husband had been accused of trading with the Apache. The wind picked up, stirring the desert dust into small whirlwinds that danced around her ankles. In the distance, the red rocks Thomas had mentioned rose like ancient sentinels against the darkening sky. Sarah's vision blurred, and she swayed on her feet, fighting the urge to simply collapse and let the desert claim them both. That's when she saw him. A figure emerged from behind one of the towering rock formations, tall, lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out his weathered face, the long black hair braided with leather, and the traditional Apache clothing that marked him as one of the people her own kind feared and despised. Fear shot through Sarah's exhausted body, but she had no strength left to run. She stood frozen as the man approached, his dark eyes taking in her condition, the torn dress, the bleeding feet, the small child in her arms. His gaze lingered on the paper clutched in her hand. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the growing darkness. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for whatever would come next. Would he kill her? Take the baby? Leave her to die in the desert? Instead, the Apache man simply nodded once, a gesture so small, so quiet, that Sarah almost missed it. Then, without a word, he turned and began gathering dried wood and brush. With practiced efficiency, he struck flint against steel, and within moments a small fire crackled to life between the red rocks. The man looked at her again, his expression unreadable, and gestured toward the fire. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground beside the blessed warmth, tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. Little Mary stirred in her arms, making soft mewling sounds that went straight to Sarah's heart. The stranger disappeared into the darkness beyond the firelight, leaving Sarah alone with her child and the dancing flames. She wanted to call out, to thank him, to ask his name, but exhaustion overwhelmed her, and she curled protectively around her baby, finally allowing herself to close her eyes. The fire continued to burn through the night, tended by unseen hands. Sarah woke to the smell of cooking meat and the sound of her baby's hungry cries. The morning sun painted the red rocks in shades of gold and amber, and the harsh desert air carried a coolness that would soon give way to the day's brutal heat. The Apache man sat across the fire from her, slowly turning a rabbit on a makeshift spit. He had changed clothes, now wearing simple buckskin pants and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. His hair hung loose around his shoulders, and in the morning light, Sarah could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived outdoors. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. The man's eyes flicked to hers briefly, then returned to the cooking meat. He didn't speak, but reached for a skin bag beside him and held it out to her. Water. Sarah accepted it with shaking hands and drank deeply, the precious liquid washing the dust from her throat. She wet her finger and let Mary suck the moisture, the baby's cries gradually subsiding. When the rabbit was cooked, the man portioned some of the tender meat onto a flat stone and placed it near Sarah. She ate ravenously, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal. All the while, her host maintained his silence, his attention focused on the fire and the surrounding landscape. After they had eaten, the man stood and gestured toward a narrow path that wound between the rocks. Sarah struggled to her feet, wincing as her weight settled on her damaged soles. The man noticed her distress and disappeared briefly, returning with strips of soft leather and what looked like healing herbs. Without asking permission, he knelt before her and began tending to her feet. His touch was gentle but efficient, cleaning the wounds and wrapping them in the leather strips. Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from a stranger, especially one her people had taught her to fear. "I'm Sarah," she said softly as he worked. "This is Mary." The man paused in his ministrations, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. She thought she saw something flicker across his features. Recognition, sadness, but it passed too quickly to be sure. When he finished with her feet, he stood and pointed to himself. "Ahiga," he said simply. It was the first word he had spoken, and his voice was deep and quiet like distant thunder. "Ahiga," Sarah repeated, testing the unfamiliar sounds. The man, Ahiga, nodded once and turned to pack up their simple camp. The journey through the rocky maze was slow but steady. Ahiga led the way, occasionally stopping to check on Sarah's progress or to point out easier footing. The leather wrappings made walking bearable, though Sarah still limped with every step. As they walked, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected guide. He moved through the desert with an ease that spoke of decades of experience, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her eyes. When Mary fussed, Ahiga would pause until the baby settled, never showing impatience or annoyance. By midday, they reached a small canyon where a thin stream of water trickled over smooth stones. Ahiga gestured for Sarah to rest while he refilled their water containers. The shade was a blessed relief from the sun's intensity, and Sarah allowed herself to remove her torn stockings and soak her feet in the cool water. "Are you Nayeli's son?" she asked suddenly, remembering the crumpled paper still clutched in her pocket. Ahiga's hands stilled on the water skin he was filling. He turned to look at her, and for the first time since they'd met, his carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. Sarah pulled out the note Thomas had given her and held it up. "My husband. He said if anything happened, I should find Nayeli's son. Show him this." Her voice broke slightly on the word husband, and she had to take a steadying breath. Ahiga approached slowly and took the paper from her trembling fingers. Sarah watched his face as he read Thomas's careful handwriting, noting the way his jaw tightened and his eyes grew distant. When he finished reading, he folded the note carefully and handed it back to her. "Thomas," he said quietly, and the name hung in the desert air between them like a bridge across two worlds. Sarah nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He spoke of your mother with great respect, said she saved his life once, and that you would understand." She looked down at Mary, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "He died trying to protect us. The men who burned our ranch, they said he was a traitor for trading with your people." Ahiga was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "My mother spoke of a white man who treated her as a person, not an enemy. She said he brought medicine for our children during the fever season, asked for nothing in return." "That sounds like Thomas," Sarah whispered. Ahiga nodded slowly. "She made me promise to honor any debt to him or his family. A promise is sacred among my people." He looked at Sarah and Mary with new understanding. "You are his family." For the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah felt something like hope stirring in her chest. 3 days into their journey, Ahiga led Sarah to a hidden valley where green grass grew beside a year-round spring. It was a place of remarkable beauty, sheltered by high red walls that kept out the worst of the wind and heat. Sarah could see why Ahiga had brought them here. It was a refuge, a place where they could rest and recover their strength. "We stay here," Ahiga said, setting down his pack beside the spring. "You need time to heal. The baby needs milk." Sarah flushed with embarrassment. Her milk had nearly dried up from stress and poor nutrition, leaving Mary constantly hungry and fretful. She had tried to hide her struggles, but Ahiga's keen eyes missed nothing. "I'll be fine," she insisted, but even as she spoke, her body betrayed her. Exhaustion swept over her like a wave, and she swayed on her feet. Ahiga caught her elbow, steadying her with gentle firmness. "You are not fine," he said matter-of-factly. "Thomas's wife, Thomas's child. My responsibility now. You rest. I hunt." Over the following days, a routine developed between them. Ahiga would leave each morning to hunt or gather, always returning with food, fresh meat, wild vegetables, medicinal plants. Sarah tended to Mary and slowly regained her strength, helped by the good food and clean water. In the evenings, they would sit by their small fire, sharing the day's simple meal. At first, they spoke little, but gradually, carefully, they began to share pieces of their stories. Sarah learned that Ahiga lived alone, that his wife and son had died in a cavalry attack 3 years ago. The pain in his voice when he mentioned them was so raw that Sarah's heart ached for him. She understood now why he had been so careful with Mary, why his eyes grew soft whenever he looked at the baby. "I was away hunting," he said one evening, staring into the flames. "When I returned, our camp was gone. My family—" He stopped, unable to finish. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "Thomas told me about the raids, the broken treaties. He said both sides had blood on their hands, but the innocent always paid the highest price." Ahiga nodded slowly. "Your husband was a wise man. He saw beyond the fear and hatred that blinds most people." In return, Sarah told him about her life with Thomas, how they had met in Kansas and traveled west to start a new life. She spoke of their struggles to build a ranch, the joy they had felt when Mary was born, and the terror of that final night when the men came with torches and guns. "They said Thomas was selling guns to the Apache," she said, her voice bitter. "It wasn't true. He traded food and medicine, yes, but never weapons. He believed in peace, not war." "Fear makes men do terrible things," Ahiga replied. They could not understand a white man who showed kindness to Apache children, so they made him an enemy. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice the subtle ways Ahiga cared for them. He would test the temperature of Mary's milk with his finger before bringing it to Sarah. He gathered soft grasses to make their sleeping area more comfortable. When desert storms threatened, he built windbreaks to protect them from the driving sand. Most remarkably, he began to teach Mary simple Apache lullabies, humming them softly when the baby was fretful. Sarah watched in amazement as Mary would quiet at the sound of his voice, her tiny fingers reaching toward his weathered face. "She knows you're protecting her," Sarah observed one evening as Ahiga gently rocked the baby to sleep. "Children see hearts, not skin color," he replied. "It is only when they grow older that they learn to hate." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't want Mary to learn that kind of hatred. Thomas wouldn't have wanted it either." Ahiga looked at her with something approaching approval. "Then you must teach her differently. Show her that there are good people in every tribe, every nation. Help her understand that the desert is big enough for everyone if we choose to share rather than fight." "How?" Sarah asked. "How can I teach her about your people when mine would condemn me for even speaking with you?" Ahiga was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child in his arms. "There are others like Thomas and like you," he said finally. "White families who seek peace, Apache families who have lost too much to continue fighting. Perhaps it is time for them to know each other." The seed of an idea began to grow in Sarah's mind. She thought of the other widows from her settlement, women who had lost husbands to the endless cycle of violence. She thought of the children, both white and Apache, growing up surrounded by fear and hatred. Could there be another way? Would your people accept such a thing? She asked. Some would, others. Ahiga shrugged. Change is like water wearing away stone. It happens slowly, but it happens. That night, as Sarah lay beside the dying fire with Mary warm against her chest, she found herself imagining a different future, not the one of revenge and bitterness that the men who killed Thomas would have chosen for her, but something entirely new. Something worthy of Thomas's memory and of the gentle man who had risked everything to help strangers in the desert. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Ahiga to teach her more about his people's ways. If Mary was going to grow up in this harsh but beautiful land, she should understand all its children. 2 weeks had passed in the hidden valley, and Sarah felt stronger than she had in months. Her feet had healed, her milk had returned, and Mary was thriving on regular meals and the clean air. But she knew their refuge couldn't last forever. The world beyond the red rocks waited, with all its dangers and possibilities. Ahiga seemed to sense her restlessness. On a cool morning when the desert air carried the promise of autumn, he sat beside her at the spring and spoke the words she had been both hoping for and dreading. "It is time," he said simply. Sarah nodded, though her heart was heavy. "Where will we go? I can't return to the settlement. They would never accept Mary and me back, not after everything." "There is a place," Ahiga said carefully. 3 days' ride south, a trading post run by a Mexican family. They ask few questions, judge by actions rather than words. You could work there, earn your keep. Sarah felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that she and Mary would have somewhere safe to go, but disappointment that their journey with Ahiga was ending. Over the past weeks, she had come to depend on his quiet strength, his gentle wisdom. The thought of facing the world alone again frightened her. "What about you?" she asked. Ahiga's expression was unreadable. "I return to my people. Winter comes soon. They will need hunters. Will we see you again?" He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke. "The desert is large, but the paths of those with good hearts often cross again." They spent their last day in the valley, gathering supplies and preparing for the journey. Ahiga fashioned a sling that would allow Sarah to carry Mary more comfortably, and he packed enough dried meat and water to last them several days. As evening fell, they sat by their fire for the final time. Mary slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, and the familiar sounds of the desert night, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone, filled the comfortable silence between them. "Ahiga," Sarah said softly, "I want to ask you something." He looked at her expectantly. "Teach me some words in your language, things I can teach Mary when she's older. I want her to know that there was once a man who saved her life, who showed kindness to strangers. I want her to remember your people with respect, not fear." Ahiga's eyes grew bright in the firelight. For the next hour he taught her simple phrases, words for water, earth, sky, family. He showed her how to say thank you and peace and friend. Sarah repeated each word carefully, committing them to memory like sacred prayers. "One more thing," Ahiga said as the fire burned low. He reached into his pack and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft buckskin. "For Mary, when she is old enough." Sarah unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside was a small carved horse, no bigger than her thumb, made from smooth red stone. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect despite its tiny size. "I made it for my son," Ahiga said quietly. Before I lost him. It should belong to a child who can play with it, learn from it." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Ahiga, I can't take this. It's too precious." "Gifts are meant to be given," he replied. "Your daughter will grow up in 2 worlds. This will help her remember that she belongs to both." The next morning dawned clear and cool. They broke camp in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they prepared to leave the valley, Sarah took one last look around the place that had become their temporary home. She wanted to remember everything. The way the morning light painted the rocks gold, the sound of water over stone, the feeling of safety she had found in this hidden corner of the desert. The journey to the trading post passed quickly. Ahiga led them by paths Sarah would never have found on her own, through landscape that seemed impossible to navigate, but revealed its secrets to those who understood its language. On the second day, they encountered other travelers, a small group of Mexican traders heading north with a pack train of mules. Ahiga spoke with them briefly in Spanish, and Sarah was surprised to learn that he was fluent in 3 languages. The traders were friendly and shared their evening meal, treating Sarah and Mary with casual kindness that went a long way toward easing her fears about the future. When they finally crested a hill and saw the trading post below, a cluster of adobe buildings beside a reliable water source, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. Their journey together was almost over. The trading post was exactly as Ahiga had described it. The Mexican family who ran it, the Herreras, welcomed Sarah warmly and asked no uncomfortable questions about her past. They offered her work in exchange for room and board, and when they saw how good she was with children, they suggested she could help teach reading and writing to the local families. Many people pass through here, Senora Herrera explained in accented English, families of all kinds. They need someone who can help their children learn, someone who understands that knowledge is more valuable than gold. As evening fell on their first day at the trading post, Sarah found Ahiga preparing to leave. He had watered his horse and secured supplies for his journey home. She approached him with Mary in her arms, suddenly unsure what to say. "How can I ever thank you?" she began, but Ahiga held up a hand to stop her. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Thomas saved my mother's life. I have repaid the debt." "It was more than a debt," Sarah insisted. "You saved us not just from death, but from despair. You showed me that there can be kindness between people, even when the world tells them to hate each other." Ahiga looked at Mary, who was reaching toward him with chubby fingers. He gently touched her small hand, and she gurgled happily. "Teach her well," he said to Sarah. "Teach her that the desert has room for everyone if we choose to build bridges instead of walls." "I will," Sarah promised. "And if she ever asks about the Apache man who helped her mother, I'll tell her about the bravest, kindest person I've ever known." Adieu. Ahiga mounted his horse as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Before he rode away, he turned back to them one final time. "May your path be smooth, Sarah Morrison. May your daughter grow strong and wise. And may yours be filled with peace, Ahiga, son of Nayeli." Sarah watched until he disappeared into the desert darkness, taking with him the remarkable chapter of their lives that had begun with a desperate woman, a hungry baby, and a crumpled note. But as she turned back toward the warm lights of the trading post, she carried with her something precious, the knowledge that even in the harshest places, kindness could bloom like desert flowers after rain. Years later, when Mary was old enough to understand, Sarah would tell her the story of the Apache man who lit a fire for strangers in the night. She would teach her daughter the words Ahiga had shared, and she would show her the carved horse that symbolized a bridge between 2 worlds. And sometimes, on clear desert nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Sarah would wonder if somewhere out there, Ahiga looked up at the same sky and remembered the woman who carried a baby and a note, and the silent trust that had changed them both forever. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures that built peace between peoples. It was the small acts of courage, the willingness to see humanity in strangers, and the faith that kindness planted in the desert would someday bloom into understanding. The fire Ahiga had lit that first night had done more than warm a desperate woman and her child. It had kindled hope in the darkness, proving that even in a land scarred by conflict, there was still room for compassion. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all.